Lost Soul Arts of Demon Souls video that I did recently, where I talked a bit about that as well. And it's not just a case of actions that the player can perform. So you're right, like this is the next point I want to make is it's not a case that defines depth. It's just that that's kind of the easiest way to illustrate it, if you know what I mean. Or it's like one of the first metrics I would go to, right? But for example, in the Demon Souls video, I talked a little bit about how in the combat in the Soul series, you hit something and you either inflict hit stun or you don't. And it is a bit of a simplification because there is a bit more that you can do. Like for example, in I believe in Dark Souls 3 there's certain sword arts you can use that kind of launch the enemy a little bit. If you're using an ultra greatsword, you can probably use attacks that slam the enemy into the ground, you know, depending on which enemy they are. But the reason I didn't really talk about them is they're kind of these very specific things that aren't all that useful against a lot of enemies. They don't really open up more options for you, you know? The main way that the game does that is more like, you know, you've stun locked your opponent or you haven't, you know? Whereas a good counter example or an example of a game that does that expands on that a lot more is God Hand, right? So basically the point I'm making is that depth is not only just the number of moves you can do, you're absolutely right about that, but also how those moves interact with your opponent. And arguably that's more where depth lies, right? But I think the more moves you have, the more likely it is that the game allows you to do all sorts of mad shit to your enemies. So, in God Hand, like for example, you can do, you know, you hit an enemy, he goes into hit stun. You hit an enemy while he's attacking you, he goes into counter hit stun, which opens him up to a lot more stuff. You can sweep an enemy, you know, after you dodge, you have a built-in sweep attack just for sweeping enemies. If you hit them enough times, you can put them into a dizzy state. You know, they can be launched into the air, or they can be catapulted across the arena, both of which are good, like, crowd control, you know, moves that help you control the crowd. They can be grappled, you know, there's probably a bunch of other little things like that I'm forgetting. And even there's lots of nuanced things that don't really fit into those big criteria. So, for example, there's certain moves that will put Jean low to the ground, right? So that dodges attacks that effectively dodges attacks that come from high. And that to me is depth as well, because if you know an enemy is going to hit you high, you can hit him without having to dodge. You can skip the dodge phase and go straightly into the attack phase. I can't do that because I'm shit at the game, you know, but yeah, that's it. And I do think that's, again, like what I just said right there, for example, is risk-reward. So you said that's not risk-reward. That would be a quintessential example of risk-reward for me, because the safe thing to do would just be to dodge, whereas the other thing to do would be to do an attack and possibly get a hit on the enemy. Like even, again, using God Hand as an example, it has different types of dodging, which have different levels of risk and reward. So there's effectively 3 different types of dodges you can do, and you know, each one is riskier but more rewarding, or less risky and less rewarding. So the depth absolutely does come from risk and reward there. And also I do think that scoring systems can add to the level of depth as well. Just to come back to your original point though, another reason I would refuse to define depth is, for example, all the stuff I just talked about only applies to action games, right? And maybe even a specific subgenre of action games, you know? Like people fighting people sort of action games. I don't know what other action games there would be, but anyway, my point is, like, something like a twin stick shooter, those kinds of things don't really apply, because it's not the kind of thing where you're doing all these complex things to your opponent. You're kind of shooting them and they die or they don't die, and the depth has to come from somewhere else, you know? So not only do you now have to define depth and try to get everybody to agree to it, you have to do it for every genre and every game that comes out, you know? So that's why I wouldn't do it. But I think it was a good question, and I hope I was able to illuminate my stance a little bit. So what I liked about your question, just in case anybody is curious, is you kind of didn't understand what I meant by depth, but you made it clear why you didn't understand that. And hopefully because you've done that, I've been able to clarify for you. So thanks very much for that one. I'm going to move on to the next one. It took 15 minutes. Hopefully they won't all take this long. Jesus. Okay, here we go. We see analysis of a game. Oh yeah, I chose this one as kind of a follow-on. I mean, I don't think it was the same person that asked, but yeah. So next question. We see analysis of a game in depth, but will we ever see analysis of how a genre can improve? Example, how to improve RPG's turn-based system / fight initiation. Okay, this is especially prevalent in backtracking. Earthbound has a fix. After gaining a certain level, enemies insta-die on ingratiating. Is that proper use of the word ingratiating? If it is, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that. Right, so yeah, so this kind of follows on from what I was saying before, and this is probably the next biggest thing that people kind of ask me about, is about genres and about how genres, you know, how games in a certain genre stack up against each other and things like that. Genres are, again, not a big thing I think I'm a big fan of, because they are, again, a definition. You'll never get people to agree to it, and also it's kind of restrictive in the way that you think. So I've said this before on the Ask FM page. I think you're better off letting go of genre definitions and just trying to enjoy each game as it comes. But anyway, that's the reason why I don't talk about this, is because genres are just too broad for me. It's just too broad, because even under a certain umbrella, what works for one game doesn't necessarily work for another game. So I'll give you an example, okay? So you mentioned RPGs and Earthbound and stuff like that. So I have made it no secret that I love the Shin Megami Tensei games, okay? Now one reason that I really love them is because they have the demon fusion system, right? Where you fuse your demons and get new demons, and you have to do that as the game goes on. You have to... the thing that I love most about the series, really, from a gameplay aspect, is that idea that your party is always changing. You are forced to constantly change and adapt your party to, you know, what's going on in the game, and also just because they're becoming outdated, right? They don't gain EXP at the same rate that you do. They don't level up. They will be left behind, okay? So you have to fuse them into new demons, and it's just this really cool... it's kind of like, you know, like in the Final Fantasy games where you've got materia, or you've got the sphere grid or something like that. It's a little bit like a different version of that, where it's deciding how your party grows, but the party member actually changes in the process. But if you think about it just as a purely mechanical thing, it is kind of like the Shin Megami Tensei series equivalent of materia, or the sphere grid, or the license grid, or whatever Final Fantasy equivalent you want to think of, because most people have played Final Fantasy, right? Junctioning, or whatever. I can't remember what the Final Fantasy 9 version was. What was it? They learned skills. They were very class based in that one. Anyway, right. So, yeah. So I love that system. Okay, I love it. I think it's great. I love it. It's brilliant. But if we take another example, Pokemon, a game which is in a lot of ways very similar to Shin Megami Tensei. You go and you recruit Pokemon for your team. You know, even though I love the Shin Megami Tensei way of doing it, I don't think that Pokemon would improve if it had that system. I think Pokemon would actually be a worse game if it had that system. Because, now I'm not going to talk about the depth of Pokemon, because I know that there's competitive people who really love the depth that it has at higher levels, okay? That's not what I'm talking about when I say this, okay? But getting from the start of the game to the end, doing the story, doing the, you know, starting off and completing all the gyms, right? I don't think that Pokemon has that same sort of depth that Shin Megami Tensei has, where you're forced to constantly change your team. Like, for example, I played the Pokemon games when I was very young, okay? Pokemon Red. Okay, I was quite young when that came out. I was probably 8, I want to say. And you know, 8-year-olds aren't very good at games, right? So when I got Bulbasaur, he turned into Venusaur, and I just fucking swept everything in the game, okay? I went in and I killed everything, even because I had leveled him up to the point where it didn't matter, you know. I was able to kill everything, even if he was weak to it. Water types just died, right? Because I was a kid and I didn't really, you know, I mean, I'm not saying I never used the weaknesses, of course I did, but Bulbasaur was my starter, he was the highest level one, he was the one I went to, and so that's how I played the game. Whereas in Shin Megami Tensei, I can't do that. You can't do it, okay? So, so in that sense, the Shin Megami Tensei one is better because it forces you to adapt. But the appeal of Pokemon is totally different. The appeal of Pokemon is that you raise and nurture this thing, you know, this animal, right? And if you had to fuse your Pokemon, throw them into the fusion mixer and kill them to get new ones, it wouldn't be as popular, right? Because kids don't like killing off their little baby animals all the time. So that's why I don't think that system would work for Pokemon. So you can see that even though those two games are in the same genre and they're actually very similar in a lot of ways, and I think that the Shin Megami Tensei way of doing things is better, I still don't think I would put that system in Pokemon, because Pokemon, the appeal is different, you know? So this is why I don't talk about genres, and why I really want to encourage people to think about games individually. Okay, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, but I gave another answer the other day. Somebody asked about how to enjoy Kamiya's games, right? And I said, I talked a little bit about how Kamiya is the type of person who he wants you to discover the fun for yourself, right? He doesn't want to tell you everything. He wants you to discover it, okay? And it was only after I did that answer, a few hours later, it kind of occurred to me that I've been doing the same thing with the channel from the word go. I try not to lay these things out in such plain terms, because I think if somebody, like what I've just said to you about genres, I think when somebody lays it out to you like that in such plain terms, you kind of go, yeah. And if you don't agree, you don't agree, and it's not going to change your mind, you know? But with the channel, what I've done is I've tried to instill this idea that every game is different, every game has different needs, you know, what works for one game, you know, what's bad in one game is good in another game, right? I strongly believe that can be true, okay? So, you know, when I see people say, oh, you know, you like this in this game, but you don't like the same thing in another game, and that's a contradiction, you know, I think those people are missing the point, and that's a shame. But I didn't want to come out and just say that, because I don't think that convinces people as well as trying to nudge you in the right direction, you know? So, thinking back, maybe it was kind of stupid of me to try and lock that idea away and just kind of nudge people, I don't know. But, yeah, I've come out and said it now, so there you go. This is the way I think about and talk about games, is that they're all different from one another, so talking broadly about genres isn't very useful for me. I don't think people should be thinking about games in that way. So yeah, I need to slow down and catch my breath a bit. Right, so sorry for the sniffling, by the way. I have hay fever. I took a hay fever tablet to try and stop it, but yeah. So where was I? We were talking about RPGs and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I absolutely agree with what you said about Earthbound. Earthbound, you gain, once you're a certain level over the enemy and you touch them on the field, they just die. Because what's the point? What's the point of fighting them again, you know? Now, I've played a fair share of JRPGs, probably more than most people. But I only played Earthbound recently, right? I don't think has it ever even released in Europe? I don't know, but I never had the opportunity to play it. So I played it recently, a year or two ago, I want to say it was. And yeah, it blew my mind that here it is. Here's this system that I have seen in a couple of JRPGs, I think. I know it was in Persona 5. You have to do a certain social link to get it. But in Persona 5, they have that system as well, where you can instantly kill enemies, right? But I played Earthbound a year or two ago, and I was blown away. That I'm like, this is in Earthbound. Why wasn't this in every fucking JRPG since then? You know, I think there was a couple more things like that in Earthbound. Honestly, it was a game that just seemed quite far ahead of its time. You know, when I played it, I was just like, why aren't JRPGs better? Oh yeah, I'll give you another example. One thing I loved about Earthbound was that there's multiple battle themes, right? And from what I can remember of the Final Fantasy games, they have one battle theme for the whole game, all the ones I've played. I mean, they have boss themes and mini-boss themes, but from what I remember, there's one battle theme for the whole game. And I think actually most of the Shin Megami Tensei games I've played have that as well. They have the Earthbound thing where there's loads of different battle themes, because why shouldn't there be? You're spending so much time playing the game in battles that of course there should be more than one battle theme, you know? It seems like this really obvious thing. but for whatever reason, nobody caught on, or a lot of people didn't catch on and do that. Maybe it was just a budget thing, I don't know. So, like, there's aspects of Earthbound that I really liked, and I thought every other JRPG should have them. But at the same time, I'm hesitant to say that that's always the right choice. Like, for example, enemies dying when they're too low a level for you, okay? You look at that system and you think, yes, it saves time and it's brilliant. Actually, some people complain about that in Persona 5, because once you unlock that ability, you can't turn it off. And it robs you of the ability to go into weak fights and do certain things, interact with those demons anymore. Unless you go and fight them head on, at which point you're at a disadvantage. It's just kind of annoying, you know? It's an annoyance. And I didn't mind it, personally, I didn't mind it. But it's just an example of how things that we think are always the right thing to do can you know, they aren't necessarily always the best thing to do, is what I'm saying. And I'm not imaginative enough to imagine a game where I wouldn't want that to happen, but I think it would be wrong of me to say that somebody else couldn't come up with a game where having that feature would be a bad thing. I think that there could be a game released where touching enemies when they die is a bad thing, and some people would say that actually in Persona 5 that is a bad thing. So this is why I don't talk in depth very much about genres. I would prefer to talk about individual games. So again, one more kind of follow-on question which I chose before we really move on to a different topic is next question, okay? With the rise of Souls-like games like Lords of the Fallen, Let It Die, Neo, and recently The Surge, Hollow Knight can be considered one thematically and aesthetically too. Do you think Souls-like will become a big thing in the future? Does it have any potential? So I'm just going to repeat what I said, and I'm going to say that labeling things like that just restricts the freedom that we have to think about them and for people to make them. You know, if somebody sets out to make a Souls-like game, they're probably going to do something a bit different than if they just tried to make a game and occasionally thought about the Souls games as an inspiration. Do you know what I mean? Hopefully you do. But for example, you list Neo there as an example, okay? I haven't played Neo yet. I've played the alpha of it, and the beta as well, actually. So I've played the 2 online tests that they did, and I can say just from what I played of it, what I'm looking to get out of Neo isn't the same thing I'm looking to get out of the Souls games. Neo, with its mission-based structure and just the general vibe of the game, like the more overt story and stuff like that, the way they've set it up, it just doesn't pull me in the way the Souls games do. And I also think aesthetically it's not on the level of the Souls games. Okay, some people, because I had that Demon Souls video lately, people have been speculating about my thoughts on Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 and all. But I did not mean, and it's not in the video, I'm not saying that those are irredeemably bad games or anything, like some people jump to these incredible conclusions. One thing I would say about Bloodborne is that it is incredible on an aesthetic level. It is, you know, in terms of executing an art direction, it is almost unparalleled in my eyes. You know, certain parts of that game are just absolutely beautiful to look at. You know, they have this, FromSoft have always had this great way of setting up levels so that they just look good, you know? They do that really well, and that hasn't changed, okay? And Neo didn't have that for me, okay? But Neo has its own things, you know, like the enemy stamina system that you can abuse to break an enemy's guard. That's really interesting to me. I'm not a big fan of the whole stance thing. I think it's a bit clumsy. Maybe my opinion will change when I play the full game. But that enemy stamina thing is interesting to me. And I think that in terms of pure combat, it's possible that Neo, you know, will scratch an itch that the Souls games don't scratch for me, you know? So even though these, and this is an incredibly specific subgenre, Souls-like, you know, people would say Neo is a Souls-like game. Even though it's this incredibly specific subgenre, I still think what I'm looking to get out of both of those games is different. And that's good. That's good. That's a good thing to me. So I think I've said enough about genres and stuff like that for now. I've probably said too much. So I'll move on. Do you think that people should consider commercial realities when playing games? They couldn't have afforded to fix this, they only had so much time, not all bugs can be fixed, etc. Or is it fair for players to criticize games for things the developers had little control over? This is, if I could pick one thing that I really flip-flop on when it comes to, you know, judging the quality of games, this would probably be the one. Sometimes I have a lot of sympathy for developers and sometimes not so much. And I suppose if I had to decide what my criteria are for that, it's more a case that as a game gets more ambitious or the budget gets bigger or, you know, the expectations are bigger, I'm more willing to accept that certain commercial realities are inevitable, you know? Take Breath of the Wild as an example of, again, there's things in that game that I don't like so much that I feel are targeted, you know, are more about the mainstream audience, you know, pulling in a mainstream audience. But at the same time, I have to recognize that a game of that size, with that many people working on it, is never going to get made just for a niche audience. It's never going to be this 100% niche game that appeals to that specific thing only. If it costs that much money, they have to rake in a certain number of people to pull that money back in, you know? So if it takes a couple of little things that I don't like for that to happen, I'm absolutely fine with it. I'm fine with it. Because if I got a version of Breath of the Wild exactly the way I wanted it to be, they'd never make another one because it wouldn't sell enough or people wouldn't like it enough, you know? The mainstream audience wouldn't like it enough. So I think to an extent, it's almost like there has to be a few things like that in there, you know? And that's the world we live in. I do think in an ideal world, you know, it wouldn't work that way, but that is the world that we live in. But if a game is really small and simple and, you know, easy to make, then I think that, you know, those commercial realities they're not so good an excuse anymore, you know? So it's again something you just have to take into consideration with the game. And I will say as well, what I don't like to see is when people start suggesting things that are completely infeasible for the developers to add. You know, when you get to the point where you're saying, oh, if only they had completely fucking changed this massive element of the game would be better. It's like, that was never going to happen, you know. This is something I really try to adhere to in my videos, is when I suggest things, and I think to my credit, if I'm going to credit myself here, I'm going to jerk myself off a little bit, I think I'm good at this. If I suggest something, I tend to suggest things that are pretty reasonable for the developers to do. I think, you know, if developers get something out of my video, it's that kind of stuff. It's the kind of, we actually really could have done this if we had just worked on it a little bit more. Like, for example, I think that's because I have a good idea of how games are made, you know? Like, for example, I complained a little bit about control options in the Zelda series, you know? And one reason I said that should be a simple fix. Now, I did oversimplify that. If I was to go back, I would probably clarify a little bit more. And I think I actually missed the menu for this shit anyway, so I could have been completely wrong. But my point is, I know how a game works behind the scenes, right? And in a game, what should happen is you don't just take a button input and put it directly into your game code. You have abstract it out. So you talk to the hardware and you say, okay, the X button, and you abstract that out into like action button, you know? And then action button does all the stuff in the code, right? And then, so if you've done that, which pretty much every game should be doing this, I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't want to code a game this way. If you've done that, then it's a case of just allowing people to change like what the action button is defined as. Is the action button circle or is it X? You know, like we've got a lot of games get changed when they come over, when they get localized, because in Japan, circle is seen as confirmation, whereas here the X button is, you know, I think, I understand both sides of that argument. You know, circle does seem more like a positive thing than an X, but also the X button is kind of more comfortable to press. Anyway, yeah, so the reason they can do that is because they've abstracted it out. It's not every single instance in the code is circle button. It's, you know, confirmation button. And there's a difference. There is a difference between those two things, because if you need to change circle button, you need to do a big fucking Control H, search and replace, every instance of circle button, and when you do that, you're gonna create bugs because you're gonna mess something up somewhere. Whereas if you abstract all that out to one line of code where it just says circle button is action button, then you only need to change that one line of code to change what the action button is. So when I say that, you know, adding in these control options should be a pretty simple fix, I have a good idea that that is the case, you know. But maybe sometimes I'm wrong about that, but I think that I've got a pretty good grip on that. And so that's something I would like to see people keep in mind more, is how a game is actually structured and the way it's made, you know. When you get to a certain point, some things just can't be changed, you know. These things have to be locked down a lot sooner than I think people realize, you know. Like a game is in, you know, it's got loads of content in it, you know, well before it's actually finished. A lot of this stuff has to get done early on, and then, you know, the final phases of the game are just ironing out shit. So, yeah, so I think that's something, it's kind of the more extreme version of your question, which is, you know, it's less of a commercial reality and more of just a development reality, you know. But yeah, I hope I've answered your question there. I think I went on a bit of a rant on that one, but do you feel there's any... Oh yeah, next question. I should prelude this with next question, so you know I'm reading a question. Do you feel there's any merit to a game with static cutscenes with zero interactivity versus a cutscene with QTEs/button prompts, or those quote-unquote cutscenes where your character is forced to walk and have their buttons locked as they watch events unfold? I think I'll need to rephrase this because it's a little messy. So you're basically asking about 3 different types of cutscenes. Cutscenes that just play and you can skip them. Cutscenes with a button prompt where you have to, you know, a quick time event, or those quote-unquote cutscenes where we probably think of The Last of Us as the quintessential example of that, where you walk along and the characters talk to each other while you have to just kind of walk. Or maybe even Red Dead Redemption, you kind of do the same thing on a horse there. I mean, there's loads of games where you do that. So I would say that I don't see a big problem with actual cutscenes anymore. I mean, I think there was a time where I was a bit more idealistic about this around the time that I played Eco, which is, God, probably, I don't know, a decade, more than a decade ago now. But there was a time when I played that game where I just thought, you know, why can't more games excise the cutscenes and just give me the actual game? But over time I've realized, you know, you've got things like Eco and Journey, which are really all about that minimalism, but they still have cutscenes. It's not so easy to just get rid of them. You know, I think a lot of developers would like to get rid of them, but it's not so easy to get rid of them. But I do think, you know, there's a lot of cutscenes that I would cut in games that I've played. Like a lot of things, I talked before about how in my Dark Souls commentary, I talked about how the reveal of Anne Orlando would be better if you just took an elevator up to it, and I still strongly feel that way. I think shoving it in my face in the cutscene didn't do anything for me. If it just had an elevator ride up and then you saw Anne Orlando yourself, it would be better. I suppose that's a minor spoiler for Dark Souls, but whatever. Yeah, so, you know, cutscenes can negatively impact things, but maybe there's a good reason why they had to use a cutscene for that, you know? Maybe, I don't know, it seems feasible to me, because, I mean, they stick you in an elevator. Obviously, that's time for them to do the fetching on the next area, because you're just in this elevator. So they could have just made the elevator ride long enough that you know, they could load Anne Orlando by the time you got to the top. So it seems totally feasible to me, but maybe there's a good reason why they didn't do it. Maybe there's a good reason why they did the cutscene instead. Again, it's actually quite in line with the last question. So there you go. There, I'm using the. Let me scroll back up. What was it? A commercial reality. Again, I'm kind of justifying it with the commercial reality, you know. But it's hard for me to say. I do think that you know, it makes sense to me that they could use an elevator, because they use elevators and all other sorts of points in the game for the same thing. But you know, maybe there's some reason for it. Maybe games are just so insanely complicated that it's really hard to say anything for sure about these kinds of problems. But anyway, unless you're actually on the development team. Anyway, so yeah, I was talking about cutscenes, and you know, Journey, it tells most of its game without cutscenes, but it still has cutscenes. It still has them. Eco still has them. Loads of games still have cutscenes. So they're not so easy to ditch. I think people us on the sidelines, we want to go, oh yeah, why don't you just get rid of all the cutscenes? I just don't think it's that easy. I think if it was that easy, more developers would be doing it. That's my stance on it anyway. Then we come to the QuickTime event ones, and again, QuickTime events are a good example of how it's not always bad. People say QuickTime events suck, and you know we're gonna, you know, they're shit, they're ruining games, blah blah blah. And I sympathize with that complaint a lot of the time. But I'm going to come back to one of my favorites, and I'm going to say, without a certain QuickTime event, the Wonderful 101 would be a worse game. It has the best QuickTime event ever. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't spoil this for yourself. Don't. But those of you who know what I'm talking about, know what I'm talking about, and would probably agree with me that the Wonderful 101 has the best QuickTime event ever. And if you took that out of the game, it wouldn't be as good. And actually, I think if it was the only QuickTime event in the game, it also wouldn't be as good. It's because the game has QuickTime events before that moment, you get used to them, and then it uses a QuickTime event to do something really fun, and it doesn't feel forced then, you know? Whereas if it had been the only QuickTime event in the whole game, I think you would have been like, what? Oh, I have to do this now? Whereas you've gotten used to them, you know? So I think that don't get me wrong, I would love for there to be an option in the Wonderful 101 that I could press. This is something, if I could suggest one thing to Platinum, it would be this, okay? I want an option in the menu where I can go in, tick a box, when I finish the game, tick a box that says skip all cutscenes and QuickTime events. I would love that, because I do that in Bayonetta. You know, I skip every cutscene now. It's not that I dislike the cutscenes, some of them are quite good, it's just they don't offer me the replay value that the game does. The game has this insanely high replay value, and the cutscenes don't have that level of replay value, so of course they're going to get skipped, right? I think maybe the reason they don't do that is it's a little bit disrespectful to the people who work on the cutscenes. They might feel that, and I can understand that. You know, you work with these people all the time, and you think, do you really want to be the guy who puts the button in that lets you skip the cutscenes? You know, it's almost disrespectful to those people in a way, you know? But they should do it. They should absolutely do it. Just put it in and let me skip all that stuff. So I want to skip it. I'm telling you I want to skip it, but I'm also saying I wouldn't want anybody to have robbed me of that experience. So even though I can agree that most of the time QuickTime events are bad, sometimes they're okay. Sometimes they're fine. And if you gave me the choice of just watching a cutscene or watching a cutscene with a QuickTime event that gets me a little bit more involved, sometimes the QuickTime event is the better thing. I'll give you like a Wonderful 101 spoiler. There's a bit, it's only a very minor thing. There's like a bit where you have to use drill to go through an enemy, right? To go through their sword. And if it happened in a cutscene, it would be cool, but it's because the two of them clash. And then you have to hammer, you know, it says, I think the QuickTime prompt says breakthrough, you know? And it says breakthrough, and you go, yes, I'm gonna break through. And then you hammer that fucking button, you're more involved. I don't care what anybody says, you are more involved in that cutscene because of that. I think my main problem with QuickTime events is that they can't be skipped like cutscenes can, you know? So if you could skip them, I'd be totally on board. I'd be totally on board. If you know, when you skip the cutscene in the Wonderful 101, it also skipped the QuickTime events for that. Fine. Maybe you could only do it on subsequent playthroughs, you know. But I'd be fine with that. I'd be absolutely fine with it. Yeah. So I think sometimes you know, if I was going to do a casual run through of the game, I would probably turn the option back on because I'd want to watch the cutscenes and do the QuickTime events again, you know. So then the last example you gave were cutscenes where your character is forced to walk. This is probably the worst one of the three. And again, I gotta wonder if maybe developers can start putting an option in here to skip them. I think, yeah, Bayonetta 2 has a few moments like that, and you actually can skip them. You can press a certain button combination and it skips all the dialogue in that moment, and you just get control back and it goes on. At least if I'm remembering it right, anyway. So that's an example of doing it well, I think. Yeah, I know exactly why people hate those moments, but again, I think if you play something like The Last of Us, you have to know what you're getting into, right? You gotta know. You can watch a short video online and know that it's going to have moments like that in it. So if you know the game is going to be filled with this stuff, and you play it, and then you complain about it anyway, you're kind of, I don't know, it's a little bit like, I get the complaint, but it's a little bit like, I'm sure you've all seen that picture of, you know, the person on the comic of the person on the bike, and they're cycling along, and they put the fucking stick through the wheels, the spokes on their bike, and they fall onto the ground, right? It's a bit like that. You should know what you're getting into. Like, you have a right to complain about it. If you want to say, I don't like the direction Naughty Dog has gone, I'm there with you. I'm with you. I think that, for me personally, I enjoy the Crash Bandicoot and the Jak and Daxter series more than Uncharted by a country mile. Country mile. Like, just, it's because it's one of those games where you control everything. It's not one of those games where you, you know, you grapple onto the grapple points and you know, the platforming kind of does itself. So I prefer those games, but also you have to know what you're getting into, you know? I think it's fine to say, I wish Naughty Dog would go back to that older style, but on the other hand, I also think, you know, why even play the game in the first place if that's what you're going to complain about, you know? So yeah, I think it's one of those things where you should be aware of what you're doing as a consumer, and it's one of those things, again, maybe I'm naive for saying this, but you can vote with your wallet on this stuff. You know, if you don't like The Last of Us, don't play it. Don't buy it and then complain about it. Just don't buy it in the first place. You know what you're getting into. Don't pretend you don't know what you're getting into when you do that, you know? And for me, I have a broad appreciation of games, so I'm okay with it from time to time. Like, I've made no secret of my love of the Wonderful 101 or whatever, but sometimes I don't really want to play a challenging game. Sometimes I want to have a story fed to me a bit more easily. I want to go through things and just kind of experience it. And I'm never going to be the biggest fan of those walking sections, but also sometimes I don't want to be doing all the crazy shit all the time. I just want to chill out, like watching a film, you know? It's playing something like The Last of Us is a more passive experience than playing something like Jak and Daxter or Crash Bandicoot. At least during those walking segments, it absolutely is, you know? But is that necessarily a bad thing? I don't know. I don't think it is. I think if you like that stuff, it's perfectly valid. But I sympathize with people who think that, you know, this is the direction games are going and we're only going to get that stuff from now on. I don't want that. I absolutely don't want that. But I also think you've got to use your head a little bit and know what you're getting into, you know? So I would like to see less of those walkie-talkie bits, but at the same time, you know, having them in some games is fine. So again, going back to my point from earlier, which is probably going to be the main takeaway from this episode of the podcast, is that, like, assuming there's ever going to be another episode of the podcast, but it's that, you know, games are different, and I don't want every game to do the same thing, okay? Whew. Oh man, how many questions? We've only gone through about 5 questions, great. We've still got more to go, but I think I've kind of ordered them so that the answers are going to get shorter as I go, I think, anyway. I put some of the more interesting ones at the front, so we're going to get a little bit more casual as we go through it. So this was an interesting one. This is a very interesting one. Do you think games can be better critiqued in the form of games, like it is in the case of films, with film reviews? Do you think there is a dimension missing from a critique that's in the form of just a video to fully understand the point? I'm not sure if I read that right. I kind of spaced out there, but yeah. So the point you're making then is that, you know, films are reviewed by, you list, what's that, Your Movie Sucks and Red Letter Media, right? So they review films and they do it through the medium of film, which is interesting. And perhaps that is the best way to review films. I think you could be right about that. What I would say, the first thing I would say about that, though, is that the videos they make, or the videos I make, or anybody, you know, making these types of videos, the videos that they make aren't the same thing as an actual film. You know what I mean? It's the same medium, but it's not really the same thing. So in that sense, I don't think it's one of those things that your question kind of makes sense on a surface level, but when I think about it underneath that, I'm not sure it does make sense anymore. You know what I mean? I do see where you're coming from, though. They get reviewed through film, and it is a great way to do it. Like, it's why I do videos instead of doing blogs, is because I can present things to you in video format and kind of use that to illustrate my points. And I'm sure those other YouTubers and stuff are doing the same thing. They're using the medium to explain certain things to you. So it's interesting, and I think one reason that it's okay. Do you think there's a dimension missing from a critique that's in the form of just a video to fully understand the point for games, right? So possibly, yeah. My answer is yeah, possibly. I think maybe in an ideal world it is the way games critique would happen, is that people would make their own little games to do it. Possibly, yeah, it is, absolutely. One thing I would imagine, something that springs to mind for me, for example, is sorry, what is it I want to say here? When I was doing my Mario series, I said that Super Mario Sunshine had my favorite movement of all the Mario games, right? It still does. It's the moment where Mario feels the most fluid and interesting to me. He has the most options. He's got nice momentum to him. He's got lots of different things he can do. It's cool. And Super Mario 3D World was a little bit stiff in that regard, and there wasn't as much you could do. So at the end of my series on that, I basically said, you know, I'd love to see something a bit more with the movement more like Sunshine, and then I added, of course, the caveat that I didn't like Sunshine's level design quite as much. You know, so it's sort of, there's pros and cons to both of those games, right? Just for anybody who hasn't seen the series, I'm not saying that Sunshine is the best or the worst, just that they have different pros and cons, okay? It's a multifaceted issue, believe it or not. Anyway, so I suppose what I could do to illustrate that point, if I had a lot of time, or if time wasn't a factor, right? I could go out and I could, you know, I'm rusty on the old programming, and I would have to learn a hell of a lot of shit to do this, and I would have to do a lot of research, right? But theoretically, if I had a lot of time, I could go out and I could make a little demo for you, like a toy box, kind of like what Ukulele did, right? Just like a little void with some blocks and shit. And then I could give you a button that swaps between the movement mechanics of Super Mario Sunshine and Super Mario 3D World. And maybe I could say to you, why don't you try playing this level with both types of movement and see which one you prefer? Because now what we're doing is we're judging, it's kind of like a control. We're kind of removing the other factors, right? Because we're playing in the same level now. It's the exact same level, and we're saying which one is better, which one do you think is better, and maybe you can play and determine that for yourself. And I think if I had done something, or if I was capable of doing something like that, I think maybe that point would come through better. I think maybe people who disagree would play it and realize, oh, actually, Sunshine does feel better. I mean, there's more stuff I can do here, you know? I have more ability to kind of make my own fun and stuff like that with Sunshine than I do with the 3D World stuff. So I do think that that could be a point. I'm not sure if anybody's ever actually done anything like that, or ever will, though, because the effort it takes to do it isn't really worth it. I mean, if I was gonna go to the effort of making a game with, you know, it's got like the movement mechanics of Super Mario Sunshine, and it's got a level that you can play around with, why wouldn't I just, at that point, I'm a lot of the way towards just making my own 3D platformer, you know? So if I was to go and do that, I would probably just drop the videos altogether and just say, hey, I'm doing it. I'm fucking making a 3D platform, because that's something I actually genuinely want to do personally. So yeah, why wouldn't I just carry on and make an actual game at that point, you know? It takes so much effort to get there that I might as well just continue, you know? So I think that's the reason why you probably won't see that, but it's an interesting thought experiment, alright. Here's another kind of interesting one. Don't know what I'm going to say about this, but how big of an impact do you think the 2008 financial crisis had on games? Seems like big companies were terrified of any sort of risk creativity at that point, and it's taken till now for them to recover. The main point I want to raise here is that it's hard to tell at all what kind of impact the financial crisis had on games, because especially because there was a new generation just 2 years before that, and of course Sony made the brilliant decision to go with the cell processor, which, you know, it makes some sense in a way, where, you know, they wanted people to gradually get more out of the hardware so that it didn't become outdated quite as quickly. I think that was the logic behind the PS3. The problem, though, is I know Mark Cerny gave a talk where he talked about the time to triangle, right? So the first thing you do if you're trying to build an engine or whatever is the first thing you do is you just try to get a fucking triangle on the screen, okay? And he said that handing them like handing somebody a PS1 dev kit and all the information about it, it takes a month to do that, right? From scratch. I don't know how true this is, okay? Because I've done like stuff like this before, and it doesn't take a month to learn it. But maybe there's something about console development that I don't know, because I know it's proprietary and it could have its. I mean, like with the PS1, they wouldn't have been using like DirectX or anything like that, so they had to have their own system for this stuff, and it's hard to do. Somebody's got to learn it and sit down and read the fucking material, and go for it, you know. And it takes time. So I would believe him anyway, because obviously he has a lot more expertise on this, right, than I do. So he said with the PS1, it took 1 to 2 months to do to get a triangle up on the screen. Okay. Now with the PS3, I think I'm remembering this right, it took 6 to 12 months. 6 to 12 months, because the hardware was so fucking weird. It took 6 to 12 months to do the same job. And that was their goal with the PS4, was to fuck that, get it back down to 1 or 2 months. Like, it cannot stay at this anymore. So that's where the presentation he was talking about. You can look it up, time to triangle. Mark Cerny will probably give you the result. But anyway, I think, you know, that's one reason why creativity sort of took a bit of a nosedive, because it's become harder and harder to actually make a AAA game, and it costs more and more money. And you know, I was gonna say age old. It's not an age old point, but it's an old point now at this point. They cost money, and the more money is involved, the less creativity there's going to be, you know, as a general rule. Because people just don't want to bet it all on some weird idea, which, you know, kind of makes sense, you know. And one more optimistic way to look at it is that those less creative games allow publishers to take risks on more creative games in the hope that the new creative game will be a massive hit, you know. So those less creative games kind of help to fund other games by selling really well. That's an optimistic way of thinking about it. It's not really the way I think about it, but anyway. Yeah, sorry, I think I'm losing my voice a little bit. So the problem then is, you know, how much of that can be attributed to the financial crisis. I really don't know, and I don't think anyone will ever be able to isolate how much of it was the financial crisis and how much of it is the fact that it's become harder and harder to make games and more expensive. And I think that you know, you say it's taken till now for them to recover. Have they really recovered? Because I don't think so. Personally, I don't think so. There's an image that gets circulated a lot with the back of and I love this, right? It's the back of the PS2 box, or maybe the front of it, I don't know. It's the back of the PS2 box, right? And it says coming this year, you know, for the PS2, right? And all these games came out within about a year of each other, right? And they're all listed on the box. And when you actually see that picture, it just crystallizes in your mind how we're not